The first time I heard about hell was not in church. It was in the NC State fan song where one of the lyrics is "Go to Hell, Carolina."
Oh,
so
wow.
at like 5, I would
Like,
hear
what
that
is
at basketball
that?
games,
Wow.
like, "Go to Hell, Carolina." What is this hell place? It's the place that Carolina fans go
Well,
to.
that's how you know you're in the Bible Belt.
In the depths of silence, where echoes remain, you were the sunrise, and I was the rain. A collision of souls, opposing in flight. I was the darkness, you yearned for the light.
All right, we're here on Friday. This is Faithful Dissent. I'm James Farlow.
And I'm Brian Metzger.
And today we're going to be talking about leaving a church denomination, specifically ours. We used to be known as the Raleigh Vineyard, and now we are known as Rivertree Church.
That's true.
And
if I can remember to say that on a Sunday.
If you could remember to say it.
Sometimes muscle memory takes over.
Yeah. It's I mean, you've been here for like 10 years, more than 10 years.
13, yeah.
13 years. And so that's pretty hard to change. It basically, I think the first thing to tell people is what is the vineyard? Because when you tell people, I've had this experience telling people I go to a vineyard church,
Right.
they're like, why are you drinking at church?
Right.
Or, where is this, what is this vineyard thing? I don't know what that means. So what is the vineyard, I guess, is the first question.
Wow. So do you want a history lesson or do you want like a snapshot? So,
Snapshot.
Snapshot would be the Vineyard in the USA sprang out of the Jesus People movement. So think late 60s, early 70s. And of course, at that time, there was a real big fascination with end times. So everything was Jesus is coming back, like great planet Earth, thunder, what was it? Thunder at night or whatever it was. It was just this whole Thief in the Night. This whole, you'd think I'd remember that. This whole series of movies about the end times. And
That was the vineyard?
no, that wasn't the Vineyard, but that was the context that the Vineyard came from. And so originally, it started as really a bunch of Bible studies, small churches that gathered in California, in the LA area, that like Bob Dylan used to go to one of the Bible studies. Lots of what would you say, celebrities at the time came through those Bible studies. It was, like if you were in that whole movement, like just even the hippie movement, you had a sense that you were at an apocalyptic moment, that everything was changing and everybody was looking for answers and guidance. And
my parents came out of that movement, actually.
Things.
So, but not the vineyard, but the Jesus movement itself. So
yeah. And so there was a church Chuck Smith started then, but Ken Gullickson was the originator of what is called the Vineyard today. Then after some time went by, Ken met John Wimber, and John Wimber had home Bible study and was growing a church and all the things. And Ken eventually turns everything over to, and by everything I mean like 5 churches over to, small churches over to John Wimber. And then Wimber starts as the pastor of the Vineyard Church, came out of Chuck Smith's church, a group of churches, and then just kind of slowly, bit by bit, things grew. But the big thing was an emphasis for John was, there were several emphasis, honestly. Several emphasis, is that several emphasi?
emphases?
Emphases?
I don't know.
Emphases?
Maybe.
You don't want to have a Caesars, but so one of the things was what we call signs and wonders, right? And so it was that everything in the Bible is for today, miracles are for today, healing is for today, and that they were not just believing that, but they were experiencing that in their services and their meetings together. There was a kind of a mythical figure now named Lonnie Frisbee.
Yes.
And Lonnie kind of famously preached at a service where there's a lot of apocrypha about it now. There's if you listen to the original recording, it's actually a little bit different from what usually gets published. But the shortest version is he prayed, "Come, Holy Spirit," and after doing a bunch of teaching, and then there were all these what now we call manifestations, and people, speaking in tongues or having some kind of an experience, kind of an immediate experience with God. That's what they believe is happening. And anyway, so that kind of it exploded the church, both in growing and also a bunch of people leaving. And but then John was also teaching at Fuller Theological Seminary. Started teaching a course on signs and wonders. I'm really condensing this and throwing a bunch of things together. But then the churches started to grow. People saw what John was doing, and they started bringing their churches into the vineyard. So it was like lots of adoptions as well as church plants. And then eventually it spread to the East Coast with a guy named Todd Hunter, who was kind of John's protege at one point. Todd came out east and he was in West Virginia. He was in Virginia Beach, and then he adopted our church. Our church was called Rivertree Presbyterian Church, a very small little Presbyterian church plant or mission church, and became part of the Vineyard about 30 years ago.
And so I know for neither of us, it's both a new movement, and neither of us started out in the Vineyard.
Yeah.
How did you end up there?
So I was in Canada, went to Canada as a Christian Church of Christ, preacher boy, youth pastor. And when I got to the church that I was going to, I was given a pack of information that was about the Vineyard. And I was supposed to read through the information and figure out how culty they were, how messed up they were, and kind of be able to present like why we shouldn't have anything to do with the Vineyard. And so I cracked open this very thick manila envelope. Do we still have manila envelopes?
They are available at some store.
Okay.
Or online.
All right. So people know what I'm talking about. So I cracked this thing open, start pulling out all these papers and reading through them. And people are saying like just these really horrendous things about the Vineyard and all kinds of accusations and descriptions. Very little is included in that packet from the Vineyard itself.
Okay.
And this is from all Vineyard USA material, or about Vineyard USA. Anyway, but it was very clear reading through the material, or it seemed clear to me reading through the material that whatever was going on in the Vineyard and whatever John Wimber was up to sounded a lot more like Jesus than these people who were writing these negative, hateful things about it. And like some of their reasoning arguments were so flawed, so terrible that it was one of those things where it's like, well, if these are your enemies, you're probably more like Jesus than not. And so then that led me into reading John White's book. I think it's When the Spirit Comes with Power, I think it might be what it was called back in the day. And that tells his story of being introduced to the Vineyard, and particularly in the Canadian Vineyard, but also the U.S. Vineyard. And then I was at like meetings, conferences, and things like that, and I found myself gravitating towards other pastors who were Vineyard pastors in the part of Canada that we were in. And it was just like, well, this is my vibe. These are my people. And that was like for Donna and I, there's a myth in the Vineyard, like a fable or whatever, where there are people who walk into a Vineyard church or a Vineyard meeting suddenly like, this is who we are. Like, this is like what we've been looking for our whole lives. And Don and I actually had, that very experience.
Wow.
Like we walked into a meeting and like halfway through the first worship set, it was like, oh, this is who we are. Like, this is us.
That's so crazy, because that's just like what happened to me when I was in college, because I started going to the Raleigh Vineyard. That's the first vineyard I ever attended. And I was at NC State at the time and looking for a church. I was a college student. And for those who don't know, NC State stands for North Carolina State Superior University in the state of North Carolina. We are red and white, not those little baby blue colors that you sometimes see down the road. Anyway, so I was there, and I came in. I think it had been recommended to me by a current elder here who was a staff worker at NC State at the time. And I came here, and the same thing. The music, I was like, oh, this is kind of where I want to be. And that leads me to kind of like the next thing to say about the Vineyard, which is the Vineyard wasn't, you described the movement that it arose in, kind of the Jesus movement, the signs and wonders. But Vineyard's not like a typical, it's not like a Pentecostal church necessarily.
Right.
And what makes the Vineyard unique and special?
Yeah. So we would say that we inhabit the movement I'm formerly a part of would say that we're in that sweet spot between Pentecostal and evangelical. In those days, it was all about worship that not like necessarily you'd listen to on the radio, though in some cases it was certainly that quality, but it was worship that sang songs of intimacy, of closeness, of personal connection to God. So rather than singing songs about God so much, it was more like simple expressions of love to God. And, it came out of this home group where you've got somebody Carl Tuttle, who just recently passed away, brilliant guy, but as a young man, he's just learning guitar, and so he can play G, C, D, and E minor. And so in those formative years, Vineyard worship was just wildly accessible, because if you could play G, C, D, and E minor on a guitar, which are usually the first chords you learn, then you could play the whole catalog of Vineyard music. Or if you could play, you could play a C chord and an F chord on the piano, you could play the rest of the catalog of Vineyard music or Vineyard worship. And so it was super accessible worship, intimate in its nature, simple in its approach and language that it used and chording structures, all those kind of things. And that changes over time, but that's where it started. And then so that was one of the things that was really special. And then one of the other things, which like we had a saying, do we use the expression here, you got out over your skis?
Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
We got out over our skis on it.
Okay.
But it's probably some of the best theology that we ever had. We just were never successful at working it for very long. And the slogan was, everybody gets to play. So at one time, what that meant was that if you came into a meeting, like a Sunday morning service or a special, whatever, I mean, back then we would meet all the time, but you came into a meeting, well, you didn't have to have any special teaching, training, equipping, none of those things. When it came to Holy Spirit ministry time, you were as good as gold to pray for people around you and actually see the Holy Spirit break in to do miraculous things in people's lives. And, eventually in the history of the Vineyard, there were decisions that were made that connected us with other groups and other people doing kind of ministry a different way. And as that happened in the history of our movement, we moved away from that thing that everybody could do to now we have some people who, it's like in the have you read Animal Farm, George Orwell? There's a slogan in Animal Farm, all animals are equal. But then eventually that gets perverted into all animals are equal. Some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah.
And so that's what happens. And so you get like, you can get Bob to pray for you for your leg that's hurting. But Jimmy is a prophet. And I once heard that Jimmy raised somebody's dog from the dead. And so you should get Jimmy to pray for your leg.
Yeah.
So once we went down that road, then it definitely started to change the nature of the movement to some degree.
And I would say like one of the things that attracted me to the Vineyard was the kind of relational aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've been to some Pentecostal churches, but I've been to all kinds of churches, the Frozen Chosen, certain Presbyterian denominations, Anglican churches. grew up in a Baptist church, several different Baptist churches. The Vineyard was very approachable. So like I've been to other Pentecostal services, like Assemblies of God or places like that. And sometimes they can feel pretty intimidating or strange.
Intense.
And that maybe, you know, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking of that. The Vineyard has a lot of different strains, but usually the Vineyard was not intimidating. Usually it was, you could come in and the worship was really, like you said, like accessible.
Yeah.
People, you know, were just interested in relating to you. And there was just an openness to prayer and hearing from God, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of pressure for anything to happen. Yeah, and I would say that was true in a lot of different areas. Like I think that like in a lot of different areas, the Vineyard was like, you know, we're about you meeting God. We're glad you're here. We're going to have some fun together. Let's go get some dinner together after, something like that. Like it's kind of like general evangelical theology.
Yeah.
We're not like super concerned about exactly how do you believe the Bible is inerrant or not inerrant, or like, I'm sure there were things that were emphasized on a or on the relational level or on the national level, but like it didn't feel like it was like these huge barriers that people kind of had to sign on
for
to.
sure. Yeah, like we were, like I would say at one time we were very big tent, and then a lot of things happened that, like in some ways, John Wimber got burned by having such a big tent.
Yeah,
with some of the people that were invited to be under the tent who then treated him badly and betrayed his trust in them. And then you also just had like theologians who, like John Wimber went to, is this too much inside baseball? I don't want to do too much inside baseball, but you know, like he went to Australia on a like a tour to Australia, and theologians in Australia, church leaders there, just grilled him mercilessly about some of his theology. And one of the things that they kind of really spanked him about was that there weren't a lot of Vineyard songs at that time, worship songs about the cross. So the cross didn't factor into a lot of John's teaching at the time.
Yeah.
And so when he came back, you know, he talked to the Vineyard worship people, the songwriters, and he said, I want songs about the cross.
Yeah, yeah.
And all of a sudden, and you can see in the history, like all of a sudden, there's like this explosion of cross songs that become a part of the Vineyard worship catalog. But I mean, it was a new movement, right? You're figuring out your way. I mean, that was one of the things that I would say was even a distinctive and the beauty, from my perspective, of the Vineyard was that it wasn't just, this is how it is. It was an invitation to curiosity. It was an invitation to explore, like, let's figure this out together. Let's go on a journey and let's see, is this God or not? And because, I mean, there were people at the time who were saying, like, this Holy Spirit stuff is not God. This stuff that, you know, praying for people and they fall down on the floor, or even speaking in tongues, or some of these other things. You know, this got nothing to do with God. Or even, you know, you got those drums up there on the stage. Everybody knows that calls evil spirits. Like this, we were in that time period, right, where
getting pressure from a lot of different sides.
Yeah. Rock and roll was all devil, and it was, you know, all these apocryphal stories of demonic drums and, you know, just madness. And so Vineyard's trying to stake out this spot in the midst of all that, and a lot of pressure. But there's a famous, there's a moment where ABC television news goes to John Wimber's church because it was so well known at that time of what was going on. And people were having these manifestations. It might look like somebody trembling uncontrollably, or somebody like shaking, or somebody jumping up and down on one foot, or whatever, just standing in place in the midst of worship. And the guy, I think maybe it was Ted Koppel, I don't remember, but it was, it wouldn't mean anything to anybody who's listening now, but the TV, you know, the reporter is saying, looking at people around the room that are having these experiences, and the guy turns to John, and there was a lady across the room from them whose hand was shaking. While she had her hands up and her hands were shaking. He said, is that the Holy Spirit? And John said, I don't know. And that's just how John, like, he was like anti-hype. And he said, I don't know. He said, here, what we'll find out is after the service, is she walking more like Jesus or not? And if it's more like Jesus, then yeah, that's probably the Holy Spirit, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And people would, a guy went to John and said, like, well, how do you, prepare for these meetings where there's going to be healing and there's going to be words of knowledge and all these things are going to, happen. And the guy was obviously like looking for, what's the secret sauce? Like, tell me what you do. And John just said, I don't know. I guess I drink a Diet Pepsi a lot before I get up to talk.
And I think that captures a lot of what was really attractive to a lot of people about the Vineyard is, there are a lot of ministries that emphasize miraculous healings or other things like that. And a lot of them are sometimes they can be high pressure or they can seem artificial or they can seem like, somebody's trying to put on a show and cause things to happen and or says you pray this certain way and then that will guarantee your healing or things like that in some extravagant forms. There's a lot of stuff that just, there's folks that because they've been burned by wanting to have experiences with God or being told they're going to have experiences with God and not, and they kind of look on those movements as if they're just craziness and charlatans. And then there's
which is fair.
And then there's people who do the charlatan thing, and it's hard to find somebody.
Sure. Yeah.
It's hard to find people who are just like, we don't know what's going on, and we just hope people find God, and we're going to try to do it. Just be honest, and some stuff might just be people doing their thing, and sometimes the Holy Spirit might come and hit people.
That's right.
And I think that captures a lot of what people are looking for because people are looking for some kind of experience with God in their lives. They're like, what? I want to feel that there's something there that is not, as you said in the last podcast, not a monologue, there's a dialogue.
Yeah.
But I don't have any control of that. I don't want to feel like I'm forced or faking or, there's no pressure for anything to happen. If it happens, it's God's. It's not anybody's special talent because they're the special chosen one.
Right.
And in the Vineyard, there was that motto is like, we believe that God can do things that are powerful today and wants to, but we don't have any control over it. And, it can happen to anybody or not.
Right.
And that was different.
Yeah, and I think what's also important is that or not was never put back on the person as some kind of a statement about their value, their worth, or their own spirituality. That if you didn't have the same experience as the person next to you, it didn't mean that God didn't love you. It didn't mean that you weren't spiritual. It didn't mean that you were somehow a sinner.
Yep.
It just meant you didn't have that experience, and that's okay.
And it's a little bit similar. The only other church I can think of that's a little bit similar in the most unsimilar way possible is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church believes in mystical, powerful, miraculous things can happen today, but it is very much not, something you expect at a typical Eucharist.
Yeah.
And it is also in the Catholic Church, there's a sense that this can happen to anyone.
Yeah.
And that it might move through a saint, but there's not like traveling prophets really in the Catholic Church who are especially anointed.
Yeah, and I think an even closer parallel for us, and this is a little bit to do with John Wimber's history, is the Quaker movement or the Friends movement, however you're familiar with it. We're very, the Vineyard, like in those encounters with God, experiences with God, very Quaker adjacent is the best way to say it.
That's interesting because my family, the Farlows, are Quakers.
Well, there you go.
Who knows? Maybe there's some DNA there.
It's in the wiring.
It's in the wiring.
Sure.
But so, I think you've captured some things that are important and special about the Vineyard, and also some things that maybe brought some challenges, which is there's not a lot. It's a big tent.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of formal structure. The Vineyard isn't really... It wasn't for the first 30 years of its existence a formal denomination,
correct.
Right? I think some of that background then leads to some recent growing pains that the Vineyard has had. Notably, some issues at some churches or a church leaving the Vineyard that was a famous church, and some issues of abuse. And I wondered if you would briefly highlight some of those growing pains that they've experienced.
Oh, wow. Briefly highlight. Wow. Okay. And I need to do this objectively, right?
Yeah.
This is like an editorial version of.
Yeah, just like the bullet points of difficult things.
So let's start here. So at one time, the Vineyard would have been perhaps, say, 700 churches across the United States. When I got here 13 years ago, it was still reporting like around 600 churches. And today, depending on which numbers you go by, it's either in the the high 400s or the very low 500s for the number of churches. And so one of the observations that were made, or I guess one of the reactions people had to that, was a bit of panic. Oh, we're dying. We're bleeding out. We're not going to make it. We need to rebrand ourselves. We need to recreate ourselves. We need to figure out. Well, not even. I wouldn't say we need to figure out. It was basically just we need to become a denomination, and these steps to being a denomination will help us stop bleeding out. And so then they entered into a more formalized structure. So part of that came out of, I wouldn't say even came out of, but I would say was accelerated, maybe is a better way to say it, by the Anaheim Vineyard, which was like the mother
the
ship.
flagship.
Yeah, flagship was
John Wimber's church?
John Wimber's church, yeah. And at one time very substantial in size. Like it was very large, thousands of people in its peak. And then the pastor who was there pastored after John, and then got to his retirement age, and the church had gotten significantly smaller, like in the hundreds and not in the high hundreds.
Oh, wow.
And so they had this, huge property. They had millions of dollars of assets, just down the road from Disneyland. And they, instead of going in-house, they decided to go outside the house to find the next pastor, hired somebody who had come over from the UK. So we'd need a whole podcast to go into that. So
a UK vineyard pastor.
A UK vineyard pastor, technically. He had left like a year before that and moved to California. Then he applied for the job, got the job, and I think, I want to say 5 years. It could have been 3 years. I think it was closer to 5 years. Then he announced that they were taking the church out of the vineyard.
Yeah.
And so basically they became their own network of churches, created their own name for their group of churches. And yeah. And so, and this was this was a top down kind of a thing. This was not a consultation. This was not.
So it was controversial.
It was very controversial because it was just like one day they said, hey, we're out. Peace out. And then the vineyard, of course, went a little bit crazy over that. And,
losing your founding church and a big donor and all those things.
Right. And the end result was, I shouldn't even say the church. Alan, who was that pastor, took the church out of the vineyard.
Yeah.
Now, if you read over the transcript of all the things that were said and done during that time, if you were the organization trying to convince me to stay and you spoke to me the way they spoke to Alan,
okay,
what I would have heard was, get out of here as fast as you possibly can.
Okay.
It was like, now this is where I'm no longer just telling you the bare bones facts, except you can read all of that information. But it was like somebody had gone to the school of John Wayne, School of Leadership.
Okay.
And so it was basically like, you better get straightened up here. We're going to come kick your...
Yeah. And that guy who's clearly capable of convincing a church to leave was not going to be...
Well, he didn't even ask the church. That was part of the problem. Yeah. But yeah. I
mean, somebody who's got that kind of independence of thought, right, is not going to be like, well, I'm gonna follow you, partner.
That's right. Yeah, not going to be wooed by that. No. So they left, and so part of the thing was, and I guess part of what you need to know is, he was able to do that legally because he was using the same bylaws that John Wimber had used, and that a large part of vineyard churches use, because predominantly across the vineyard, we got our bylaws by calling somebody up and saying, hey, could you send me a copy of your bylaws? And they Xerox a copy of the bylaws, and they send you the copy of the bylaws, and then you did whatever you wanted to do.
Yeah, okay.
But he did it legally by following, he did exactly what the bylaws allowed him to do.
And so since we were such a loose association, that's something that could happen.
That could happen super easily. It could happen all over the place. Like they're still, in fact, I was talking to somebody recently who was just telling me how the pastor at a Vineyard church that they had attended had told everybody, hey, this is a pastor-led church. Like you don't get a vote, you don't get a say, you just have to do
What the pastor
says. Which is like, wow, that's like saying the quiet part out loud. But that's the reality in a lot of those situations. Like what is the saying? It's not a bug, it's a feature. That's just a part of it. And so there were churches leaving, and then one of the big things that happened was that, let's say around 15 years ago, there was a conversation that was taking place, particularly among academics and pastors in the Vineyard, about LGBTQ plus inclusion.
Yeah.
And for some people, that was like, should we worship Satan on Sundays or should we not worship Satan on Sundays? Like that was the reaction they had to just the existence of the conversation was a visceral negative reaction.
Yeah.
And so for some people it was, hey, if that's where the Vineyard's going, I'm out.
And for other churches, because the thing about the Vineyard is it's such a big tent, like there are churches that were very what you would call progressive in the church space.
Way ahead.
I mean, and it's hard for people to wrap their head around because, you're talking about churches that are somewhat open to the move of Holy Spirit and have what we call contemporary worship music. They would feel like evangelical churches, but happen to be fairly progressive, which is another very unique thing about the Vineyard. And these all were in the same movement.
Yeah.
And
and like herding cats.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then about 10 years ago, the Vineyard USA published what they called a position paper on how to pastor LGBTQ plus people, which has disappeared off of the official pages of the interwebs, but you can still find it if you dig around. And the fundamental flaw of the paper was that it was about, I want to say 80 pages. Only 2 pages were actually about how to pastor people that contained what they call the foul lines, the things you're not allowed to do. And it's hilarious. Like even at the beginning, it says how to pastor LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
And then like almost immediately on the inside, it said B, T, and Q people are too complex for us to address in this paper. So this is fundamentally about L and G people.
Okay. Lesbian and gay people.
Yeah. So instead of saying that, though, like instead of calling the paper How to Pastor Lesbian and Gay People, we put all the alphabet on there.
Yeah.
Because we want to be perceived as, addressing
traditional
this whole thing, but we're not. And so.
And when you say position paper, again, because it's not a denomination, like this is not really a formal theological stance in the same.
This is.
It is?
Yeah. And that was part of the thing that was fascinating for me at that time was that what I would say is the first official theological position staked out by the Vineyard, by Vineyard USA, was their position on LGBTQ+.
Not on the scripture or
anything else.
Okay.
Not on the mode of baptism, not on the Trinity, not on spiritual gifts. There had been, previously, there had been a position paper on women in ministry, but it was non-binding. Your church didn't have to have women pastors or elders or leaders.
Yeah.
So you weren't required to practice this. It just was that you couldn't try to burn down the Vineyard churches that were practicing women in leadership. In this case, though, as the national director at the time told me, this is non-negotiable. This is how it is. This is the way it's going.
Yeah, and some churches had to leave the Vineyard. And pastors had to leave the Vineyard who were affirming. And I think it's, some people could criticize and be like, well, this was, you had such a vague set of principles that something like this was always going to happen.
For sure would, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you said earlier is right. This was a young movement.
Yep.
And it existed in a particular place. I would say, for all the battles that have been going on in Christianity in the past 30, 40 years, the late 90s and early 2000s and 80s even were a time where there was a hunger for something like the Vineyard, where it was just like, let's just not get too up in arms about this and let's just be about like connecting to Jesus. Like that's the legacy of the Jesus movement. And
the anticipation that Jesus is coming back at any second.
Yeah.
So if he's coming back at any second, we really don't need to get this all sorted out.
Yes. Another legacy of the Jesus movement.
Yeah.
And there are things about that are open to criticism, but they're also, I think when people criticize, they miss some of the really beautiful things about that.
I agree.
Which is just emphasis on people, emphasis on connection, emphasis on faith in a very grounded personal way that didn't have a lot of barriers. But then I would say there was probably some other, so there's those challenges in Anaheim and with other questions with churches leaving or, about LGBT issues and other things. And then there's also been some issues where there's been some prominent abuse scandals as well.
That's right. Yeah. And not so prominent abuse scandals. But most recently, from a few years ago now, 2 years ago, things exploded at the Duluth Vineyard in Duluth, Minnesota, where the son of the couple who were pastors of the church, the husband father was also not only pastor of Duluth Vineyard, but he was also a trustee for the vineyard. And
the national vineyard.
The national vineyard, and had previously overseen the Multiply Vineyard, which was the church planting ministry of the vineyard or department of the vineyard. And the largest chunk of the budget for a really long time was under his portfolio. And then Brenda, the wife, she was what became known as, in the new reorganization or denomination, super regional leader. So there are 3 super regional leaders, of which she was one. And
so these are important people.
These are people of power and position, and they're people who are not just local church pastors, but their line in terms of who they're accountable to goes directly to the national director and the national office. And I would say, like, from my perspective, this is strictly me telling the story, things were just handled poorly right from the beginning. When the announcement was pretty late in coming out, like it was already hitting the internet by the time Vineyard USA made an announcement. And then when they did, initially there was a very long form video by the national director that was very, let's just say it was not victim centric. It really leaned heavily into looking after the husband and wife team, looking after their reputation, their well-being, restoring them, before we had really very many details of what had actually happened. And so what had actually happened was that their son had been accused of just sexually abusing several.
Serious. And I would say, like, this is not a... they said it was consensual. They said it was not. It was like, these were minors. These are things that were like real crimes. Like, This was not one of those situations where it was questionable. This was like a serious violation of the law.
Yeah.
Devastated lots of people. Yeah. Like there's no like gray area here.
Right. Yeah. He's in jail now as a result of these victims coming forward and telling their stories. The problem was that the victims had come forward before, or their parents had come forward before, and sadly, one of the victims actually ended her own life with all the turmoil that she was experiencing. But like one of the mothers of one of the girls had gone to this guy's mother, who was one of the pastors of the church, and told her what this pastor's son had done to her daughter. And the mother of the perpetrator said, well, your daughter's just always seeking attention. And there were other things like that happened. It just in every respect, it couldn't have been handled. I guess it would just be hard to find a way to handle it worse than the way it was handled by the national office, by the mother and father, and initially at a local church level, as allegations had come, and basically things got funneled back to the dad, the senior pastor, and to the mom, and just died there. And so you just had a terrible mess and devastated people, and the way the national office responded was less than good. But the thing is, then once you start looking into that, you find out actually something else, like there was also a victim in Columbus, Ohio, and you can read that victim's story online. And then the more you dig, the more you discover, oh, there are other people who've been victims and other people who've been, harmed. And there are stories of how the national office did not respond to them in a way that was helpful or appropriate.
And, if I'm thinking about a lot of this from like a 20,000 foot level, this happens in almost the history of every church, of every movement, is you have a kind of like a beginning of a movement, and it's relational and it's new and it's vibrant, and then it grows, and then it comes to a certain point and you're used to this relational way of doing things, and all of a sudden that doesn't work necessarily anymore.
Right.
I mean, this is why accountability and lines of authority and all these rules that accumulate in denominations happen is because of the complications of managing lots of different people.
Yep.
And of course, especially with regards to things like abuse or of leadership or committing actual crimes, like there have to be ways that are formalized, because people, just like families, they're not the best at handling when somebody they love and care about and know either commits a wrong or is connected to people who commit a wrong. Most of the time, humans aren't the best at handling that emotionally. Like they have to be either trained or have very specific procedures to make sure that things are done well and that issues of power don't corrupt the system. It's just very difficult for humans to handle that.
For sure.
It's very tough. I would say the situation in Duluth sounds wildly tragic, and sadly something that happens when church denominations don't have these set policies and rules that are followed over time. And I think that kind of leads us to where we are today, which is the overall response of the Vineyard to all of these things is to push to become an actual denomination.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now, right?
Yeah. So, but what you just described also demonstrates the fallacy of that step.
Okay.
Because every denomination that you can probably think of right now, you can think of at least one glaring story that's come out.
Okay, yeah.
About abuse that took place inside of that denomination.
Yeah.
Here you've got the Roman Catholic Church, who, if anybody knows how to be a denomination, it's the Roman Catholic Church. And yet their incidents of abuse are off the charts, right? Yeah. You can pick any denomination, and they've got their reporting structures. They've got all their, you look at the Anglican Church, almost as, they've been around a long time too.
Yeah.
Rampant. You look at the Baptist Church, Southern Baptist Convention. There's just been a huge part of things. It's not having those rules and policies and procedures and all those things in place. Sadly, if you're not the kind of person that is going to pay attention to the victim and be victim-centric, those rules aren't going to make you that kind of a person.
Yes. Well, and the abuse conversation is almost, the history of that is relatively new in terms of public accountability. Mm-hmm. It's just not something that was often talked about or dealt with before probably the 80s. I mean, like these things happened forever. But like, if you go back in time, you're not going to find like, it's not the same kind of reporting and things like that.
No. I mean, you could say that too, just even about families. Like you had that uncle where you were just told, don't be alone with this uncle. But
churches have had to deal with the whole of like, this person leaves and this person splits. And so then these denominations are created to handle those kinds of things.
Sure.
That's what, yeah.
No, and I think, I agree with the point that you're making about that, like for sure. But I guess what I'm in part reacting to is that the move towards becoming a formal denomination has been, like the incident of abuse has been used by Vineyard USA as a justification or an explanation for why this is so important. When we know full well, and I could even give you instances now that since they've started this, like they created this reporting hotline that you can call in if you've been abused. But I know people who've used the reporting hotline and then their report has just been turned over to the senior pastor of the church, in some cases, who was actually the perpetrator of the abuse that they experienced.
And I think that leads directly into the movement of our church, which is, okay, yes, there's this movement to become a denomination, perhaps for the official reason of fixing some of these flaws.
Right.
But as we examined the move to become a denomination, we have found that we don't have faith that this process is actually going to fix any of these flaws, which are so obviously there.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So let's go through, in our process, our church, I'll just say right off the top, our church has not left the Vineyard movement because of some of these scandals that have happened. They've informed some of the decisions we've made, but the reason we left has to do with the denominational process itself.
Yeah, I mean, had those other things not existed, would we have felt the same pressure? Yeah, probably we would have, truthfully. But but for sure, I think there was at least among our elders, it got to the place where it was hard not to feel like not saying something, not raising a serious objection was making us complicit to, what had happened to all of these victims.
Yeah.
And so it's hard because it did happen, it's hard for me to separate those things. But I would say for sure they've taken a very top-down approach they've taken to becoming a denomination that made it feel unsafe for us to continue.
And so let's go through a couple of those points. And some of this is legal and in the weeds, but we'll try to make it as clear as we can. The first thing is that Vineyard announced that this kind of thing was going to happen, that we were going to move toward becoming, did they say becoming a denomination?
I don't know how often that language was used explicitly, but it for sure is the subtext, yeah.
Well, and they hired somebody to talk to them about this, right? To come up with a plan, right? Isn't that right? To say, hey, the national board said, was it Guideposts or somebody to say, hey, what are these problems? We need to address them. And the recommendation was?
No, they detailed in 2020, they detailed to denominational leaders, the problems as they saw it. Later, they would contract Guidepost Solutions to do an institutional assessment that magically Guideposts assessment, their conclusions matched all the things that they had already put out to everybody in 2020.
Okay. So for Claire, what are those
things? We'll just call it a beautiful case of synchronicity.
Okay, so what are those things that have matched?
Oh, what are the things that have matched? No formal national ordination.
Okay, good. Yeah, so there's not an ordination process for
there
Vineyard.
Wasn't. Yeah, there is pastors now. But yeah, so most of it was everything that just transpired. So there needed to be more accountability and to be reporting structures. You had all these volunteer leaders. You had an overworked national director. You had only a percentage, kind of a very low percentage giving of local churches to the denomination, and some churches not giving at all. Yeah, just several of these kind of things.
And so what they did is they sent out an amendment that churches who were going to become and remain a part of the Vineyard would have to sign. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So we hired a nonprofit attorney.
Yeah.
And that nonprofit attorney examined the handbook in the church that we have to abide by as a part of the new denominational structure.
Yep.
Which is very normal. There's in Methodists, I think it's called the Book of Discipline in Methodist churches. Mm-hmm. And there's another name for it in Book of Common Order, I think maybe in Presbyterians, Book of Order. So there's normally a handbook that denominations require their churches to sign on to.
For sure. Nothing wrong with that.
Yep. And so we're totally good with that. The issue is that certain parts of the handbook right now are unfilled in. Is that right?
Unfilled in.
Yeah, they're blank.
Yeah. Well, they're vague, super vague, so vague, like a hole so big you could drive a truck through kind of thing. And as we were told at a regional meeting, they're intentionally vague. And so they can be made to mean anything. So it talks about, needing to be educated, but it doesn't define what that is. It talks about, behaving yourself, but it doesn't tell you what kind of behaviors are okay. like the question I asked was, if I'm with a bunch of Vineyard guys at a conference and we're all sitting around at dinner, so if I'm in, say, Colorado where pot's legal and everybody else around the table gets a glass of wine, am I going to get in trouble for lighting up a joint? And, the statement at the time was, well, we don't want to get into it sounded very spiritual. We don't want to get into the minutia and be legalistic about it. But the point is, if you don't know what is in and what is out, you're only going to find out when you get kicked out.
And that was the key is they could, is it true they could basically quiet or even remove pastors for not following these standards, which are not spelled out?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't, it's very careful in how it says it. But they can pull your ordination. And if they pull your ordination, you can no longer, your church can no longer, as a Vineyard church, under this bylaw amendment, is not going to be able to employ you as the senior pastor. That this is part of what you're agreeing to is that the senior pastor is going to be ordained by Vineyard USA. Vineyard USA controls your ordination. So as they recently told one Vineyard pastor, in the absence of any clarity on these guidelines at all, told them that, they were insufficiently submissive to their leadership. How do you define insufficiently? Who gets to decide what is sufficient, what is insufficient?
Yeah.
So it's language like that leaves you in a place of all the controllers with the national office. There's no inside of that handbook. There's nothing detailed about how you address something that they've done that you don't agree with. Like I know in, say, for instance, in Presbyterian circles or in Lutheran circles, if you feel like you have been wrongly penalized, then there's a procedure in place for you.
Yeah, there's actually
appeal.
a church court. So
right.
If you are in, I know the Presbyterian church pretty well. If you're in the Presbyterian church, they actually have a church court which will try pastors for certain things, like if there's been embezzlement or if there
right.
was abuse of authority or
right.
some kind of, they don't try them in a criminal sense, but they try them in a sense of you have rights that go along with your ordination. And
right.
so you can't just be accused of something and have no recourse. And that is also, those courts are separate. It's not like they're just run by the national director.
Right, exactly.
Run by a jury of peers or near peers, other pastors, who are objective observers who don't have any stake in that. And that's normal. And of course, every denomination does it a little differently. But there are always clear lines of authority, or there should, in the older denominations that have done this, there's clear lines of authority and rules. And in other denominations, say Southern Baptists, there are no rules in terms of these things because Southern Baptists are specifically locally governed.
Right.
And they know that. So if you're a Southern Baptist and you're a Southern Baptist member of a church or you're a Southern Baptist pastor of a church, you know that the governance happens on a local level.
Right.
And you sign on for that. The Vineyard, prior to this move, was also governed on a local level.
Right.
And, has had some issues coming through all of that. And now they're moving to a more Episcopal model, almost, you could say, a national
for
model.
sure it is, yeah.
But there's also, not only is it unclear on what the discipline is, local churches and pastors don't necessarily, as far as I understand it, churches don't necessarily have a vote. These changes, changes are not.
You have no voice in it.
So this is not.
Pastors don't, churches don't, no representation.
So that's key, is there's no representation in this change. It's not like the denomination is getting together and having a large council, like the Methodist Church does every 2 years, and they vote on changes to the Book of Discipline.
Correct.
That is not happening in the Vineyard. We are not getting together and voting for changes to our handbook.
That's right.
It's made by a few people on the national level.
That's right.
With no real input other than just general feedback.
That's right. And their decisions are binding.
That's
all. You have no recourse. There's nothing you can do about it.
So when our lawyer looked at this, it was okay, we're in this denomination. It's having some issues. And we're moving towards a more formal structure, and these things are undefined. It's undefined. It's not clear how pastors are judged or disciplined. It's not clear. There's a lack of clarity about how often pastors need to be accredited for their organization. If they have to re-up it every year, every other year, that's unclear.
Yep.
It's unclear on how if a church chose to leave the vineyard after the signing of this handbook, would they be able to take their property to a different church?
Right.
That seems there's some lack of clarity there, which puts the property in jeopardy.
It's the kind of thing like where our position was, like, we get that you've got things you haven't figured out yet. We respect that you don't want to just throw everything into a document so that you can have it this weekend. But why get us to sign on to something that's not complete? Why get us to why the rush? Why does this have to be done today? And the response at the meeting was, well, we had to pick a date. I mean, at some point we'd have to pick a date. Well, it's like, well, yeah, but you pick a date after you finish it. You pick a date when you say the questions are answered.
And from my own personal perspective too, like just becoming a part of a denomination that has no voting representation among the national board is just, it's very difficult for me to even think of another church that works quite that way. I mean, even churches that are much more Episcopal, there's like a level of authority, and then like that goes to the next level of authority, and then that goes to the next level of authority. And there's always like these thick structures of like, even you can think of the Catholic Church where there's a synod of bishops, but it's like they've come from there's priests, and those priests become bishops, and those bishops they vote on things that go to the Pope, and it's a very complex system that has multiple layers of push and pull that are involved. And that's the most top heavy I can think of. But where, like, every other Protestant church, which the Vineyard, if nothing else, is a Protestant movement, has a representational voice among the leadership decisions that comes from the clergy and from the people in the pews. And that's so far absent. And I can't see, if I was advising a church, I would never advise a church to sign on to that type of structure.
Right. No, I mean, it's just, from our perspective, it was just wildly unhealthy. And when our legal representative said, I just can't advise you to sign this document, it just kind of crystallized what we were already feeling about it. And it's weird to be in a place where I feel like we haven't moved. We're in the same place that we were before this whole thing started. It just feels like as an organization, they've moved away from us. And that's fair. I mean, if that's what an organization wants to do, it's just we also maintain, our own agency, and we can object and say, we're not going to go there with you. Yeah.
And I mean, it's hard, just reflecting back on the process. I mean, it was a unanimous decision for our elders and basically everybody I know in the church. It was just very, very clear. And when you have an attorney who's like, you just shouldn't do this. I mean, it's really obvious, but it's something to leave a movement that you're birthed in.
Oh, it's terrible.
I think that's what, we've struggled with is we want all those things that make the Vineyard special to still be a part of the DNA of who we are.
Right.
And so now what we're looking forward is like, well, where do we go from here? How do we do this from here? And I think for people who might be listening who are just not a part of the Vineyard, I mean, I think that's something that is resonant is what do you do? But I think in current society, this is happening a lot, but you also come on these points in your life where all of a sudden, the people that you were moving through life with are moving in a different direction than you thought. And how do you reconstitute after that happens? And I'm just wondering for you what that's been like for you as a pastor, and what that's like for that you've heard in our church expressed as we're taking these steps.
Yeah, well, I talked to my therapist. There's grief that's involved, mourning and lament. There is commiseration, talking with other people in the same boat, as well as talking to people who aren't. I've got friends who are vineyard pastors who are riding this out. Like they've signed on, they're good to go, and I pray that it doesn't harm them in the end. And I don't. There's a lot of things that I don't understand, but I don't have to understand in order to be friends. And then partly it's looking around at where can we belong? What should we connect with? Because we want to feel like we're part of something. The struggle is, I think, well, like I said, like we don't feel like we've changed. And so what we find ourselves looking for is the Vineyard.
Yeah.
And
there's not another Vineyard.
Right. And so it's like, well, what do we do then? Well, we could join this group. They're sort of, like the Vineyard. Well, I don't want to belong to something just because it's kind of sort of like.
Yeah.
And so we're on this journey that we hope to be able to find, like, I think the thing that is hopeful right now is that we are in relationship, and I'm in relationship with other pastors, and as a church, we're in relationship with other churches and other pastors and things that we're still relationally connected to others. And so our connections didn't start or end with the Vineyard. And so that's good and that's hopeful, but it is still a question of what, and I think we could have a whole nother conversation about why do we want to belong to something else. But I think that, I think the sense is that we do, but trying to figure out who and what that is it's a little
Daunting.
It's daunting and it's a little bit sad because it's like, like constantly saying, well, but you're not like this, and but you're not like this, and it's not perfection that we're looking for.
But we're looking for a match.
Yeah.
And something that you said earlier that stuck out to me, you said in other episodes, was people of peace.
Yeah.
We're looking for people of peace. And I think that is a place that many, many people are in. That we've got our little story here in the Vineyard, but I think there's a lot of other people who've had people in their movement who moved in a completely different direction than they expected. I think that is a common story, and there is a remnant left behind that is like, wait, I was going in this direction, and all of a sudden it's changed. And the thing that just stuck out to me was like, we're looking for people of peace.
Yeah.
And I know for us in the Vineyard, we're looking for people who are relational, want to be connected to God, to Christ, want to emphasize personal relationship with others, want to be open to what the Spirit of God is doing, but never feel like it's forced, and that move can come from anywhere and any person.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that has drawn me to the Vineyard and has drawn me to other churches like this is I always look in churches to see if kids are involved in the music. And like regularly, are there ways that like youth are getting involved in the music? And that's a good sign that the church cares for community and people over performance.
Right.
And so I'm looking for other people who want to have kids involved in their music and value the whole community in that kind of way.
Yeah.
So if you're out there and you know of anywhere, let us know.
Yeah. James's phone number is
1-800-CHURCHES-FOR-US. Well, thanks for listening today, everybody. Like we normally say, if you loved our podcast, please give us a 5-star review and tell others. If you hated our podcast, stop listening and never mention it again, which there may be some of those after this particular podcast.
Fair enough.
But we always welcome anybody to contact us, reach out, and let us know what you think. So we'll see you again next week.
Cheers.